Hello everyone, this is Gayla Kesey, Education Manager here at the Augusta Museum of History. Thank you so much for joining us for another virtual Brown Bag Lecture. We have another wonderful program for you today. But before we get started, I wanted to tell you about some upcoming events we have scheduled at the museum. The third Monday of each month, we host Monday at the Museum, designed for ages 3 through 7. This month, our topic is quilts. We will take a look at the museum's newest quilt display and read about a very special quilt in the quilt story. Afterwards, we will have fun getting creative with different shapes to make a quilt block. Mondays at the museum are currently virtual, presented via our Facebook page and YouTube channel. We have auditions for our Voices of the Past program on October 19th. We have openings for the Petersburg boat captain, the Augusta civil rights activist, and a freedwoman. This is a paid position. Each character will perform one Saturday each month. Please contact me for the script and for more information. On Halloween, the museum is hosting a special escape room event, Murder at the Mill, based on a real-life murder at Sibley Mill in 1906. Unfortunately, or fortunately, for those who manage to get in, all the slots are filled, but visitors are invited to come to the museum for trick-or-treat. Our final Brown Bag Lecture this year will be November 10th. And feature the museum's registrar, Natalie Smith. Natalie will highlight Augusta's women in our collection. Mark your calendars to join us for 2 holiday traditions at the museum. The 2021 Holiday Gingerbread Village will be set up in the Rotunda from November 18th through the 28th. Each historic themed gingerbread creation will be available through silent auction, with proceeds benefiting museum programs and exhibitions. The display and the opportunity to bid on the structures are free to the public during regular museum hours. All aboard the Polar Express on December 5th and 12th. Tickets are on sale now and going fast. The 1 o'clock slots both days are already filled. Make sure to come by or call and get your tickets today. Today we are talking all about women in the election management process with Lynn Bailey, Executive Director of the Richmond County Board of Elections. Lynn Bailey is a native of Augusta and was mentored by former longtime director Linda Beazley. Lynn was appointed Executive Director by Richmond County Board of Elections in 1993. During her tenure in Augusta-Richmond County, she has overseen the administration of 9 presidential elections, as well as numerous other state and local elections. In addition, she administered 3 distinctly different voting systems: punch card, electronic touchscreen, and the current ballot marking device system. Over her career, Lynn worked with the leadership of various state and federal agencies and working groups to assist with the development of laws and rules pertaining to the overall election administration process, with particular emphasis on facilitating absentee voting by active duty military and U.S. citizens residing overseas. Lynn, thanks for joining us.
Greetings. I'm so happy to be here with you today. This year's Brown Bag series focuses on prominent women in government, and I'm so flattered to have been asked to come and talk to you today about women in government. This year marks my 33rd year as elections director in Richmond County, so it's been a long journey for me, and we've seen a lot. During today's discussion, I plan to talk about varying topics, from highlighting a few women who have been instrumental in my career discussing how elections and voting has changed over the years, running for public office just a smidge, and also the new election reform bill that will go into effect, or that is actually in effect now and will certainly affect our elections in 2022. I've had the privilege over the years of working with some amazing women. In fact, our wacky world of elections is chock full of strong women. Women who have a desire to serve. I'm not sure that any of us get into this line of work on purpose or intentionally, but once exposed, it does seem to take hold. I was talking to this about with a female colleague recently, and said that I was going to be speaking to this group today and what I plan to talk about. And she said, well, you know why there are so many women in elections? And I said, well, no, why? And she said, that's because we are all control freaks and we know that we can do it better. And so it resonates with us, with our personality to do that. And as much as I hate to admit it, I think there may be some truth in that. As far as I mentioned earlier about women being the backbone of election administration, nearly 70% of the election officials who do my job around the state of Georgia are women. 70% of the people who do my job are women. Later I'll talk about poll workers and the magnitude and the impact that women has on poll worker and election administration on down the line. I personally began my journey by happenstance when in 1978 I applied for a job in the elections office, not having any idea what I was getting myself into, but knowing I needed a job. So I went to the elections office. I was fortunate enough to be hired. I immediately took to it. I found the work fascinating. I loved the fact that we were helping the public. I loved the fact that we were educating the public. And even as an 18-year-old, I realized the value of what it was we were doing and the service that we were providing. I think I was inspired a good bit by the person who hired me, who was the late and certainly great Linda Beazley. She had faith in me. She had confidence in me from the beginning. She mentored me. We worked together very closely for 15 or 16 years, and I lapped up every ounce of education and energy from her that I could get. She made the job fun and interesting. She was strong and courageous, never backed down from an issue, never backed down from a problem. She was fair, kind, honest, and all the things that you hope your election officials and every election official around the country is. She and I together battled through 4 presidential elections and had so much fun doing it. You know, it's great when you can work $80 or $100 a week, 80 or 100 hours a week for about that much money, 80 or 100 hours a week, and walk away from it thinking, wow, you know, that was cool, that was pretty fun. But that's honestly the way I felt about the whole thing. Linda went on to serve, once she left the elections office in 1992, she went on to serve as county administrator for 3 years, and then ultimately went up to the state of Georgia and was the state elections director for the state from 1995 to 2005. And the really great thing, I think, about her circle is she was the first elections director in Augusta-Richmond County, having been appointed in 1973. Prior to that, she worked in the probate court office, the office that administered elections. So she had a rich background in elections when she was appointed as director. So in 2005, again, she retired from the state of Georgia as the state elections director, came back to Richmond County, and was immediately asked to serve as chair of the Richmond County Board of Elections. So she really did come full circle, starting that office in the first place in 1973, and then coming back with all that knowledge and experience that she had gained over the years, and sharing that with us in Richmond County through the Board of Elections. It was certainly our privilege, to work with her and have her all that time. She served with us until 2010, at which time she retired as elections director for health reasons, but certainly left a long-standing mark on the election community. To this day, 11 years later, I'm constantly asked about her, and there are a lot of remember wins, or do you remember when she said this, and she's constantly coming up in conversation. So she definitely made a profound mark on elections across the state. In 1993, as I say, Linda left the elections office, and that's when I was actually appointed as elections director. I was scared to death. I didn't want to do it. I was intimidated by it. I mean, I was 33 years old, and it seemed like a really, really big job. But I went home, talked to my husband about it, and we kind of went back and forth, and he said, look, if you don't take that job, how are you going to feel if someone else is hired and you are basically showing them how to do that job? You can do this job, you know how to do it, and you need to go for it. And so I did. And I honestly would have never thought all these years later that I would still be here doing the same thing and still loving it. But here I am, and with those great positive feelings. At the time when I took the job in 1993, as I say, it was a big decision for me and our family. We had 2 young children at home, and thankfully my husband was very, very supportive, as I said. But it was definitely a balancing act, trying to make sure that the child care was covered and everybody was happy at home. And I think that women in particular suffer with that affliction, if you will, maintaining that balance at home, and that probably goes back to why we tend to be control freaks, because things need to be balanced and managed, and my goodness, for the most part, if we don't do it within our family unit, it perhaps won't get done, but it will certainly be better if we do it, right? So I took the job in 1993, and for a number of years everything went along just fine. We had a great presidential election in 1996. We had a great presidential election in 2000, but 2000, our worlds got rocked. You'll remember Florida 2000. You'll remember the hanging chads, the dimpled chads, the pregnant chads. You'll remember, like I will, the visions of people holding those punch cards up to the light to determine if a voter had tried to make a punch on that ballot. And for those of you who may not remember what those ballots looked like, they were old key punch cards. And the voter would get a ballot, put it into a machine. They had a punching device that they would plug down into a hole, and it would punch out a perforated piece of paper, and that would represent a vote on the ballot. Then we had tabulating machines. Those cards were run through. The tabulating machine counted 1,000 cards a minute, so they whipped through there pretty quickly. But they basically shone a light behind the ballot as it went through, and the scanner detected. It knew if this hole was punched, this certain candidate got a vote, and it detected the votes as it went through. Now the problem came in, and what we saw in Florida was those instances where the perforated piece of paper didn't come fully detached from the punch card. It would hang there, it would swing, it would, one time you would run it through and it would be open, and the next time you would run it through, and through the fan system or whatever with the scanner, it may close back up. So those were the types of things that they were looking at in Florida. I remember watching those proceedings and seeing colleagues of mine from around the country testifying as subject matter experts with the punch cards. It was really a riveting time for elections in Georgia, and a time I think that called us all to snap to attention and fully realize that in our own county here in Richmond County, that was the exact same voting system that we used. And in fact, in most large jurisdictions around the state, that was the voting system that was used. So, as I say, we looked at it and thought, boy, that could so easily have been us. During that time, I had the pleasure of working with the second most influential woman in my life, and that would be then Secretary of State Kathy Cox. She was an outstanding leader for the state of Georgia. And shortly after the November 2000 election, she realized and recognized that Georgia could have a problem. And she immediately set about writing a paper that outlined her thoughts on that. The paper was called the 2000 election, a wake-up call for change and reform. And she was spot on with the title and spot on with her comments. As she went through describing Georgia elections, she described them as being complex and involving a wide variety of participants. And she also described them as being important to the process, but perhaps undervalued by local governing authorities, underfunded by local governing authorities, kind of the people who only had to work a couple of times a year. That, that kind of attitude was prevalent and still is today to some extent. So, as I say, she recognized in her paper that elections were complex. She expressed her concerns about punch card votings, especially regarding the overvotes and undervotes. And just as a little education on that, because we'll come back to those terms later in the talk, but an overvote would be a situation where an overvote would be a situation where an individual who was casting their ballot intentionally or perhaps on accident voted for more than one person. Sometimes that happens because people look at a long list of candidates and they're like, oh, I like this person and I'll vote for them, and oh, I like this one too, so I'm going to vote for them. And I tell you, if you turn a voter loose with their own devices, voting their ballot in private, which they should, you never know what you're going to get back. We, particularly on the mail-in absentee ballots, we get notes, we get, it's a wide variety of things that people do, even though the instructions say clearly color in the bubble by who you want to vote for, fill in the oval. Some voters will take a pen and circle the person, the whole name that they want to vote for, ignoring the bubble, or others will mark through a person's name and write not now but never, and all kinds of funny things that people write on their ballots in their own environment. And the same was true with punch cards, actually, because punch cards didn't provide a way to prohibit a person from overvoting a ballot. So somebody could go in there and vote for 2 or 3 presidential candidates, and like the runoff that Georgia had back on January 5th, where there were 20 candidates. The ballots that we saw come in from voters, the hand-marked paper ballots, sometimes would have 4 or 5 candidates marked out of the field of 20, when clearly they were only entitled to vote for 1. So that's an overvote, and it happens for an array of reasons, always on a hand-marked paper ballot. Undervotes are votes where a person skips a race. They don't vote for anyone. So going back to 2000, and what caused us to change our voting system is Secretary Cox analyzed the votes from the November 2020 election, and she recognized that there was an abundance of overvotes and undervotes related to punch card voting, and that was of concern to her. So we created in 2001, legislation was creating the 21st Century Vote Commission, and I was privileged to be a part of that commission. And as a member of that commission, we traveled the state, we traveled the country. We observed elections, we observed multitudes of voting systems, and then ultimately made a recommendation to the Secretary of State's office on the type of voting system, not the vendor, but the type of voting system that we thought would work best for Georgians. At the end of the day, that was in 2001, and for the 2002 elections, we implemented a brand new voting system that many of you will remember, which was just a touchscreen electronic voting system. Very simple, very easy to use for voters. We had very few instances where voters had problems with it. In fact, if anything, voters, especially our elder voters, would somehow think that they were playing a video game or something when they got in front of it. They'd be like, oh, look, we're going to touch this one, and oh no, we're going to unlike that one and do a different one, and move back and forth. And generally speaking, it was a good positive experience for voters. That system worked really well for Georgia. But the downside of that system, even though at the time it was the most sophisticated system out there, the downside was that there was no piece of paper affiliated with the ballot. So just like we had questions around the election during 2020, Lord knows we all know that there were questions from that election, but the great thing about the system we have now is that the voting system, while it's still touchscreen, it is accompanied by a piece of paper. And we can use that piece of paper when votes are close or when we have to do recounts or whatnot. It's a good backup for the electronic vote count. Georgia, as I said, Georgia used the touch screen voting system up until 2019. Since that time, since Secretary Cox left the Secretary of State's office, she's gone on to do many things. Her latest venture was serving as Dean of the Law School at Mercer University, a position she held from 2017 until her recent retirement in 2021. She continues to be a positive force for election officials. She is so willing to share her personal cell phone number with us that we work together. We talk. She's just a good public servant and wants what's best for the state of Georgia, just like the rest of us. So, backing up a little bit from 2020, following the 2018 elections, then Secretary of State Brian Kemp recognized that it was time to update Georgia's voting system once again. Obviously, the DRE had done well for the state of Georgia, but this was computer equipment and technology that was 21 years old at the time. It was time for an update in many ways. Secretary Kemp established the Secure, Accessible, Fair Election Commission, known as the SAFE Commission for short, to do the same things we did during the 2020 ventures, where we went out to jurisdictions. We saw voting equipment being used by citizens. We conducted pilots around the state. Many public hearings, heard from voters, got lots of good input. When that process was finished, the members of the commission, which again I was so privileged to be a part of that selection process as well, but those members wrote a report to the Secretary of State, who was then Secretary Brad Raffensperger, expressing our belief that of all the systems that we saw, we thought the voters of Georgia would take best to a system called a ballot marking device. And we also realized that by using a ballot marking device, in other words, the voter would continue to mark their ballot on screen, and by doing so, it prohibits them from overvoting their ballot. It just doesn't allow it. So it does provide for, I think, a more true representation of the voter's intent than we sometimes see on hand-marked paper ballots. Now, there's great debate out there over which system is more accurate and more true, and I'll leave that to the academic folks to figure out, but I can tell you from my experience that the ballot marking device was well received by voters in the state of Georgia. They had no problems walking right up, putting their card in, using it. It felt familiar to them. And we're going to talk a little bit later about other reasons that I have confidence in that system, more related to the system itself and the tabulation of votes. But that's the process of how we went from where we were to where we are now. On that same line, we were talking about the voting equipment. I'd like to give a shout out, if you will, to our poll workers here in Richmond County. I mentioned earlier in the talk that women play such an integral part in the voting system. In our county, in Richmond County, for the 2020 election, 70% of the people who worked at the polls were women, and 60% of those women were 61 years of age or older. So it is that community that supports the voting process, makes it available for voters to come in, and are as dedicated a bunch as you will ever see. They don't mind adversity. They genuinely want to help, even through the public health crisis that we had. For the most part, our poll workers stuck with us. They didn't think for a moment of being afraid to be out there. There were some that we lost due to health issues, and when I say lost, I mean could not work with us for real reasons. But for the most part, our workforce here showed up for us in an unbelievable way. I think they were heroic, actually, and made things go at a time when things were not so smooth. And it is for that reason that the women in my life that I admire the most are, in fact, poll workers. The folks that come into those polling places at 5:30 on election morning and work sometimes under horrific circumstances, between questions from the voters, people's discontent here lately, and just the nature of working at the polls and the demands of being on your feet all that time and talking for all those hours. A day at the polls consists of being there at 5:30 in the morning and working till 8:30 or 9 in the evening if you're lucky. Sometimes it's longer than that, depending on the situation. And we don't pay all that well. It's not something you necessarily do for the money. Most people who do it do it because they have a genuine desire to serve and to be of help to their community, and for that I will remain ever grateful. We are poll workers, we are the caregivers and the doers. Continuing on with the 2020 election year, the election year of all election years, I must say, never to be forgotten, forever remembered. It was the most challenging and yet at the same time, oddly, the most inspiring and invigorating election I've ever worked. The problems and the hurdles were, sometimes seemed insurmountable. But if we could keep our wits about ourselves and just focus on one thing at a time, which we really tried hard to do, it worked for us here in Richmond County, and I think it worked for 99% of the jurisdictions in the state of Georgia and around the country. But, I must say that those jurisdictions that had failures were spotlighted to the point that it really did cast a shadow of doubt across the whole process. Very, very unfortunate. We heard a lot of talk about Fulton County as an example, and the fact that during the June election they had horrific lines. Well, it's important to know that in Fulton County, they have around 300 election day polling places. I think around 120 of them canceled on them just a couple of weeks before the election because they didn't want strangers coming into their facility and exposing people to COVID. There was a worry about that, and so they opted to not participate. So, all of a sudden, a couple of weeks from the elections, they're faced with all these polling place closures. Same thing happened with their poll worker base. They had many hundreds of poll workers who canceled out, many of them at the last minute. And you combine those two things, and it is going to make for long lines on election day, and it did. There were stories, although I don't have any firsthand knowledge of it, but there were stories of lines that were 7-8 hours long and sometimes longer. But I must say, the Fulton County Elections Office, just like any other elections office around the state, our desire is to succeed. Our desire is to provide this service in an efficient and effective way. They turned things around and had a great election in November and another great election in January. And they've been going strong ever since. So, COVID affected us all in different ways. And that was just, one experience of what happened in another county in Georgia. We definitely put our voting system through its paces, for sure. We were scrutinized during 2020, unlike anything I've ever seen. And it really brought home to us the importance of good record keeping, the importance of not just seeing that the records are filled out and complete, but knowing how to get your hands on them. Thousands of pieces of paper, all over the place, forms coming in from the polls and whatnot. And so we've worked really hard, especially since the June election, to put ourselves in a better position to have those documents easily available, because the open records requests are real. We've responded to hundreds of them in the last year and a half or so, and we're in a much better position to do that these days. During the 2020 election cycle, though, I mentioned that we put our voting system through its paces. Most of you will recall that included a hand recount of the ballots that were cast, and it included a machine recount of the ballots that were cast, and this was all focused on the office of president on the November ballot. So the hand count we conducted at the Bell Auditorium, and it was a beautiful thing to behold, and I wish more people had been there to observe it. Down on the floor of the Bell Auditorium, there were 50 tables set up. Each table had 2 citizens, just like me, just like you, wanting to help out in the process, sitting at the table. We brought ballots over to them in batches of 50, and those 2 people counted those 50 ballots and marked down how many votes President Trump received, how many votes President Biden received, and how many votes the Libertarian candidate received, and put those on a piece of paper. Once they finished counting those 50 were removed from the table and they were given a fresh batch to count. This process went on across those 50 tables for nearly 2 days. And at the end of it all, at the end of the hand recount and at the end of the machine recount, out of the 87,500 530 ballots that were cast in Richmond County. Mr. Trump lost 1 vote, and Mr. Biden picked up 2. Now, I would argue that that is very strong evidence that our software that machine counted those votes did so extremely accurate. The only difference, I mentioned the 3-vote difference there. Mr. Trump lost 1, Mr. Biden picked up 2. Those would have occurred, again, going back to those hand-marked paper ballots. When voters mark a ballot, if there's a questionable mark on it, let's say a voter colors in a bubble and then accidentally draws their pen down the page, that vote is looked at by a citizen panel, and they determine what the voter's intent was. You may look at a ballot and think the voter's intent is one thing, and a separate group of people may have a different opinion on that, and clearly that's what happened with the 3-vote difference that we had here in Richmond County. The 2000 election year culminated in an expansive election reform bill, and I'd like to wrap up my talk today by highlighting some of the more important changes provided in that bill and how the changes may affect voters as they make their choices moving forward. And I think this is an appropriate venue to do that. These changes will affect the voting process across the board. It affects our poll workers, it affects men and women alike, and people should be aware of these things. So, voting absentee by mail. The most common complaint I hear regarding voting absentee by mail is a concern that this new legislation requires people to make a copy of their photo ID to send in with their absentee ballot. But that is not necessarily true. What the new law does do is it mandates that voters provide a driver's license number and their date of birth when they apply for a ballot and when they send their ballot back in. So it is true you have to possess a driver's license or a state-issued ID card, but you don't have to make a copy of it. If you don't have one of those things, and it's reported that 98% of Georgians have one or the other, then you would have to make a copy of some type of ID to send in, but for the vast majority, that will not be the case. I'd also like to share with you something I found in my office today. I was preparing for our talk and remembered that we had these little forms. This is actually an application for an absentee ballot from the 1970s, from an old City of Augusta election, and it simply says, "I hereby indicate that to the best of my knowledge and belief, I am qualified, eligible to vote in this election." The voter put their name and address on it. That was it. And here's what we have today. It's a front and back, very full 2-page form. So, things have gotten a little bit more complicated over time, and, rightly so. You should be able to identify yourself and prove who you say you are in order to vote, and we should, as election administrators, only allow folks who are eligible to vote to cast their ballot. So all this information helps us do that. We've also changed the time period that absentee ballots requests can be sent into us. So that time period has changed. It's moved from 180 days to 78 days before the election. So that's a pretty big change. And also, they have to be received by us by the 11th day before the election. So not to get too down into the weeds with all that stuff, but the big takeaway is that voters need to take it upon themselves to know these changes. Particularly if you plan to vote by mail, just take a moment, familiarize yourself with the changes, and then react accordingly. And if you do that, there's nothing to worry about. We're going to get your ballot to you, and as long as you get it back to us by the close of polls on election day, we're going to count it for you. So don't be fearful of it. Be knowledgeable and get yourself educated. Get a plan for voting and carry that through. I mentioned earlier that absentee ballot requests have to be received by 11 days before the election, and that's also the deadline that we can mail out ballots. And so previously, we could mail out ballots beginning on the 3rd day before the election, but now we will mail out ballots, ending on the 3rd day before the election, but now that deadline moves to the 11th day before the election. So again, we need to be smart about it, think ahead, and know your plan. And once you decide how you want to vote, don't waste any time. If you want to vote by mail, give us your application so we can get your ballot to you. I think of all the things in the new election reform bill, drop boxes was, one of the biggest things we've heard complaints about. So back in 2020, the spring of 2020, and thanks to the foresightedness of Secretary of State Raffensperger and the State Elections Board, they permitted, on an emergency basis, permitted counties to establish drop boxes if they wanted to. Not all counties did, but most did. Those drop boxes, we were permitted to put them outside because the whole point of the drop boxes was to keep the chances of person-to-person contact as low as possible. Frankly, to keep a bunch of people from coming into our office, because we did not need to be sick. We had an election to run, so and he realized all that. So he put the drop boxes in place, and along with that were some pretty extensive, sometimes cumbersome security requirements. Those boxes were kept outside, so they had to be secure. They were open 24/7. So they had to be permanently affixed to the ground. They had to be constantly surveilled by video surveillance and things like that. But at the end of the day, they were very well utilized and appreciated by citizens not just here in Richmond County, but around the state. Thousands and thousands of citizens also recognized the importance of minimizing in-person contact with other people during those times. And just didn't want to risk going out in public. As an example, just to kind of bring that point home a little bit, Richmond County, in our county, 32% of the votes cast were cast by mail. And this goes back to the 2020 election. So 32% were cast by mail, 45% were cast during advance voting, and the other 24% were cast on election day. In a normal presidential election year, say November of 2016, those numbers changed dramatically, with 6% of our voters, instead of 32%, voting by mail, 47% instead of 45% voting during advance voting. But the big one is 47% in 2016 voted at the polls, but only 24% voted at the polls during this November's election. So we really did have a change in dynamics, and I think that was seen likely across the country. I think as we move forward, we're going to see things normalize a little bit. We'll see fewer people voting by mail. People want to go to their polling place to vote in many instances. And, frankly, hopefully we can move on from this public health scare and regain some normalcy in our lives. But those are the numbers that we saw in 2020, and it was impressive. For us, for us in our office, we went from sending out for a presidential election around 6,000 absentee ballots to sending out 38,000 absentee ballots. Huge change in operations for us. I mean, you could just imagine the logistics of managing all that. Very, very challenging time. Another thing that was focused on, let me continue with the drop boxes for just a second. As a part of the election reform bill, the state of Georgia did write into law, into general statute, a mandate that every county in the state provide a drop box for its voters. It also built in structure about where those drop boxes could be placed and how voters could gain access to them. So they're now required to be indoors at advanced voting centers and are available to voters through the close of business on Friday before the election. So if your plan is to bring your ballot and drop it off, please know that you'll now need to come inside. There's also, continuing with that law, should we find ourselves in another state of emergency like we did in 2020, it is written into statute that we can do things differently and provide drop boxes in a different way. But for right now, as we normalize, drop boxes in the state of Georgia will be indoors at advanced voting centers or in the Board of Elections office. Another thing that was looked at, we talked earlier about some of the long lines that we saw in 2020 around different parts of the state. The General Assembly took note of that, and we are now mandated to check the wait time of how long voters have to wait in line to check in at their polling place. And we have to do that 3 times a day at every precinct on election day. So as we do that and we monitor that on a regular basis, it should give us some really good feedback and insight on what's going on out there at the polls on election day. So if we have a polling place where voters have to wait in line to check in for more than an hour, then we immediately take action on that. We have to either establish a new polling place, or we have to put more machines in, or do something to correct that so that it doesn't happen moving forward. So that's a new thing, but I think a really good change. There's general oversight built in the bill across the board on transparency, on accountability for local election officials. It tightens up the whole process of reconciliation at the end of the day, reports that we have to look at and verify, which is good. It provides extra transparency by well-defining areas where the public can watch and see what we're doing as we go about our business. Also very good. Again, in elections, transparency and accuracy are the two most important things. And so this bill goes a long way to promote that. One last thing I'll say about the new bill before I move on is I'm sure we've all heard by now that the law prohibits anyone from giving voters refreshments while they're in line. But I encourage you to please take that in the context that it was meant. In Richmond County, this is not a new procedure for us. We had many people who wanted to provide refreshments to voters in line in 2020. We wouldn't permit it. And the reason we wouldn't permit it is because there is a buffer zone around the polling place. It's 150 feet from any part of the polling place that's a protected, sacred area, if you will, for voters. It's where they stand in line and go inside the polling place, and it's meant to be there hassle-free for them. I talked to many volunteers when I told them why they couldn't be there, that there's no campaigning in that zone. And what I heard over and over again is, we're not campaigning, we just want to give them some refreshment. And our comment was, how do we know what people are saying to people as they approach them in line? We don't know. We're not standing there with them. And we have a duty to protect that safe buffer zone for voters. So the optics of it are terrible to actually write into law that refreshments are prohibited. I will agree. But I think that if you step back and get away from that emotional aspect of it, it's a way for us to preserve that buffer for voters and to keep them from being approached by people as they wait in line to vote. That law does say that if we feel the need, if we see people standing in line and suffering and parching from heat or whatnot, we can provide refreshments to voters if we deem it's necessary. So we can do it, but the general public, they just can't do it. And that's now written into law. So, moving forward to 2020, election officials around the state of Georgia are very much aware that Georgia will remain in the spotlight on a national level. We're very keen on the fact that our work will be scrutinized to the nth degree, and we're okay with that. It's that kind of thing. I think it's all about being organized up front, having your ducks in a row, and making sure that you get your checklist completed. A lot of it hinges on poll workers and how they do their job, but we do provide adequate training, as do other counties around the state. And I will say that again, just to reiterate, the poll workers are the backbone of the whole thing. They're the heroes, and if you know someone who works at the polls, you need to thank them. In 2020, in Georgia, we will be electing a United States Senator. We will be electing a governor, secretary of state, other state offices, and here in Augusta, also the mayor of the city of Augusta, for a new mayor. For the first time in 8 years, we'll have a new mayor. Right now, the last time I checked, we had 8 candidates that had pre-filed to seek the office of mayor, so it's going to be a really eventful year and no lack of things for our voters to vote on. We will, the Richmond County Board, and I'm sure other local election boards, will continue to protect our voters by asking voters that come in to wear a clean face covering. That has not changed. Inside the polling place, you're in pretty tight quarters in there. It's sometimes really tight quarters. So we need to protect ourselves, and we'll continue to put hand sanitizer out there for folks to use and make sure that it's a safe environment for our voters and our workers. At the risk of repeating myself, I can't say enough that voters should make a plan for voting and make sure that they're prepared by having their identification ready and whatnot. Skepticism remains high surrounding the 2020 election in our whole country. My fervent hope is that we can all find some peace with it and relieve ourselves of the burden that I think many of us carry even now. I would encourage anyone having trouble releasing that angst about the election, how it's conducted and the results, to consider being a poll worker or a poll watcher. Get involved in the process and educate yourself so you find answers to these lingering questions that pester you, the what ifs that are out there. Because I guarantee you, if you do, you're going to find that there is a robust system of checks and balances in place that protects your vote. There's bipartisan cooperation and review every step of the way. So it's not like we're out there doing this job under the cover of night. Well, it mostly is at night, but still, we're transparent and we're open about the process, and that is nothing new. So again, I would encourage anyone with doubts to come out and work at the polls. I myself, especially after going through the experience of the 2 recounts in 2020, have complete confidence in our voting system. I fervently believe that the voting system counts exactly what it sees. It counts your ballot exactly as you mark it. There's no switching, there's no flipping. It counts your ballot just as it's marked. And I also believe that the hand recount that we did, where it was not a machine hand count, human eyes were looking at that, proved that point quite well in my mind. So with that, I'll thank you for your ear today. I hope you found the talk somewhat interesting. Many of you know that I'll be retiring from my position as election director after 33 years at the end of this year. In fact, I will say that it's 79 days from today, but who's counting? I have great plans of devoting my time to my family and doing things that interest me. And one of those might even be working at the polls. You never know who you might see at the polls. So I hope to see some of you there. Thank you very much for letting me be with you today.
I hope all enjoyed our presentation today. Feel free to email us at the museum with your comments or questions. Thanks so much for joining us.